Coming up, the New York Football Giants front office and PR departments continue to spiral into chaos. But meanwhile, a head coaching candidate and GM hire that could bring stability and potentially a high-powered offense back to New York. We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your host. Over here, Adam Armbrecht, over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise, and we're talking about another head coach and GM tandem that in this week's edition, I believe, could be a winning combination for the New York Football Giants, Andy. We, of course, remind that today's episode is brought to you by Personam, P-E-R-S-O-N-A-M. That is a ability to have a network security insight onto the way that your network is functioning, see threats and detect them before any other platforms are capable of, and also just give you that peace of mind. So go check out personam.ai today, Personam.ai. Andy, before we dive into this tandem, as many people know, sometimes we give the peek behind the curtain. You and I, we often debate, what should the episode be about? What should we discuss first? And at a minimum, we're going to give a little aperitif to Friday's edition, which will be more heavily focused on another layer of dysfunction for the organization. But it's the reason why we're going to talk about GM and head coach again today. The Giants, PR, Pat Hanlon, things are falling off the rails here that make it feel like the cleaning of this house could be everybody, potentially. Andy, take it away.
Yeah, no, Adam, listen, I think this is why these episodes that we are doing are so important, talking about a potential new coach and GM tandem. The more things come out, the more it feels like this path is not only likely, but necessary to be able to get the organization back where it needs to be. And we're not going to go into depth, but to explain why we're devoting every single Wednesday episode to a new coaching GM tandem, we've had planes fly overhead multiple times in the last two home games from two different groups. And I promise you there will be another plane coming for the last home game against the Colts. You can bet on that one. And in between there, we have people in the front office that are messaging podcasters and people in the media and telling them to stop or else they're getting access cut. There's a wild amount of dysfunction that's going on. And it's because of exactly what we're talking about today. The organization from top to bottom is not as stable. When things go awry and the team only has 2 wins, to see it crumble the way it has, this is the important piece of it. Who are the people that could put the puzzle pieces back together to make this a functional and reputable franchise once again, Adam? That's why I think these conversations are so important. It's who can lead us to the place we want to be, not who is currently keeping us in the situation that we're in today.
Yeah, a lot of familiar faces with the dysfunction inside the organization. So we'll talk on Friday a little bit more in depth what's gone on around the organization. Because, by the way, too, more planes overhead, probably more moments like we've had with the PR department and the way that they're communicating about how they're being covered and the access that they grant to those who are covering them. Like, this gets into those murky waters where, well, if we're such a tire fire and you're going to tell people that we're a tire fire, we're not going to let you tell anybody that we're a tire fire. It's just I got to tell you, it's a very unfortunate state of affairs for the New York Football Giants. That being said, why don't we fix it all? Why don't we fix it all in one clean sweep? Andy brought up bringing in a head coach, former player like Mike Vrabel a week ago. And that's already, by the way, gotten some additional traction in this past week. So there's a real world when you watch us, we're giving you the next possibility that people are going to start talking about. Go ahead, Andy. Yeah, I know you want some flowers or victory laps here.
What I want to let everyone know is that these conversations are extremely relevant. And just to show, right after we released the potential John Robinson, Mike Vrabel, major media outlets are reporting that John Robinson is interviewing for the Jets general manager position.
Yeah.
Dan Orlovsky's coming out saying that Mike Vrabel kind of already knows his destination on where he's going to go. If you read the tea leaves, John Robinson and Mike Vrabel, people are already pointing to them as being the tandem that is going to take over the New York Jets, which to me is like, okay, maybe we're scratching at the surface of some of these different connections. It seems that those connections are playing out in real life right now.
And yeah, and some people even said that Mike Vrabel, in regards to the Giants and the Jets as well, said that should be their number one choice. They said the Giants should want him too. So, we battered around where that value would be. Stability is the big word that gets brought up around Vrabel and bringing him as your head coach, bringing back organizational stability. Lord knows both teams in New York could use that. But I wanted to go a little bit deeper cut here because we're going to talk about Detroit at some point. We're going to talk about in-house guys, which seem harder and harder to bring up as viable options for New York at this point. And then there's also some ones that Andy and I have discussed in the background, looking over at the Commanders and coaches that have been in head coaching roles and are now having success once again as coordinators. But how about we go out to LA, baby? Take a spin with me, Andy, here. Mike LaFleur, you may know his brother's work out in Green Bay, is a head coach now as head coach candidate as an offensive coordinator right now, who has a great track record of who he's been around. And my number one selling point on this is not just that his brother's been successful, because he can't do that, but I can go to Harbaugh's and say, hey, brothers seem to have success around the league. But it's the fact that he goes all the way back to, started with the Falcons, offensive assistant in 2015-16. They were 17 yards per game that year, 21st in points per game. You can debate whether or not that's great, but that's when you have a tandem of, as I look off to my notes, my apologies, Matt Ryan, Freeman, Julio Jones, like getting kind of into the latter stages of his career a little bit. He goes on to the 49ers, starts at the pass game wide receivers coach 2017-18, holds the pass game coordinator role into the next year as they pass off wide receiver responsibilities. But that's 9th in points per game. That's going to give you with a Garoppolo-Hoyer tandem that year with injuries, and the following season as well. This is getting into the Brock Purdy of it all. You have Pierre Garçon, Goodwin, and that's the first early start of the Kittle's career, right, as he's coming at the tight end spot. We'll get into other stops here along the way. The Jets before coming over to the Rams. But when you have been underneath McVay, when you've been underneath Kyle Shanahan, I think that there is a real value when you talk about coaching trees experiences, seeing a coach like LaFleur who has basically gone through these stops and offered consistency in terms of being around some of the best offensive minds in the game.
Yeah, Adam, I like the name Mike LaFleur, obviously, because Matt LaFleur has had success, but Mike is no slouch either. You mentioned it before. Yep. The stops that he has made in Atlanta with Matt Ryan, in San Francisco under Kyle Shanahan, as well. And listen, the tough part for me is where you've ended the story is not where the story concluded on Mike LaFleur. And obviously, he took over. So Robert Saleh ends up getting the head coaching position from moving from the defensive coordinator of the 49ers over to become the head coach of the New York Jets. He has a great relationship with Mike LaFleur, brings him over as the offensive coordinator and says, run Kyle Shanahan's system for me. I'll take care of the defense. We're going to be good to go. And so my challenge to you is Mike LaFleur took over in 2021, and in that draft, with the second overall pick, they took Zach Wilson. And so my first question to you is, what level of hesitation does it give you that Mike LaFleur was the OC and presumably had to co-sign the idea of Zach Wilson being able to run his offense, and then subsequently seeing how it just was an absolute mess with Zach Wilson for the New York Jets during Mike LaFleur's tenure?
Yeah, and this goes into the same category because it's going to be the question up, right? Because now he ends up in LA, and there's actually bringing up Robert Saleh is a nice little tidbit here when we're thinking about building out a coaching staff. But what I like about what I'll say is, just like the Giants, the Jets have been a mess. And same way that like Robert Saleh was probably never destined to be a head coach in that role, I don't know if anyone was destined to be successful as in any capacity for the New York Jets. Now, the point of, was it LaFleur who said Zach Wilson's the guy, right? Like, this is the guy that you get me him, I will develop him and turn him into XYZ, right? If that was the case, then you probably would have a little bit of pause. But I would also take a higher level step back and say, I need the talent evaluators, I need the assistant GMs, the scouting department, the GM to ultimately say, we've put all this work together and compiled it all. I would be a little bit hard pressed to think that Mike LaFleur came over and was like, I'll tell you who the quarterback is going to be. Maybe I'm being naive about that because Saleh was a defensive-minded head coach and you want to give that confidence to him. But even said, when you look at Zach Wilson, he's a miss. Okay, fine. What I take away from those seasons with the Jets is that you're talking about when Mike White came in for 4 games and completed almost 67% of his passes, when the offense looked a little bit more dynamic in that season. I also go the layer deeper beyond that too, because in that first year when he's there, it's Elijah Moore, who ends up not being a part of the long-term future with the Jets, although he's had success. Corey Davis. You're talking about Keelan Cole, talking about Jamison Crowder, Braxton Berrios. It's not a laundry list of high-profile talents. When you fast forward the year later, and you can think about this with Malik Neighbors, much as we've talked about him this season as well, you go and you look at it and you say, when we went out and drafted Garrett Wilson, well, guess what? 1,100-yard receiver, right? Immediately comes in, 147 targets, 83 catches. You find ways to make him successful. And so, you try to pick and pull these pieces that you think are valuable. And more than anything, because that's not a great defense of it, right? You draft this quarterback, you're the OC, you want it to be successful, it doesn't work out. More than anything, I'm going to, much like I think everyone does with the Jets and the Giants, I'm going to look at everything else you've accomplished in your career, and I'm going to give you a pass at the one stop, which, by the way, before you got there, not good. After you left, not good. And the Jets offense, even with Aaron Rodgers, unhealthy, healthy, Tyrod Taylor, hasn't been good either, right? So I think there's enough of a sample size without these coaches in place just to say these are bad teams, bad organizations, ironically, just like the Giants.
Yeah, so my only tough thing with Mike LaFleur, because I do feel like he is a good coach, and obviously other good coaches want him on their staff, is like
Yes.
in 2019, the San Francisco 49ers went 13-3. He was the passing game coordinator. He was a key cog of the coaching staff. They had CJ Beathard, Nick Mullins, and Jimmy Garoppolo as the quarterbacks on their roster. And so the question is, do you give Mike LaFleur credit for them being able to get the most out of those quarterbacks? And like, I'll walk you down the path is, if you give him credit for that, then you almost have to take away the credit when he is the full offensive coordinator under Zach Wilson, because like you can't say that he's responsible for the good stuff, but then not the bad. The other piece of it is he's had success under Kyle Shanahan, and Mike McDaniel was the offensive coordinator at the time, who clearly is a brilliant offensive mind. You see how great the offense can look under Mike McDaniel on his own for the Miami Dolphins. So my tough part is, if you remove Kyle Shanahan and you remove Mike McDaniel and you remove some of the brain trust or the guys at the top of the tree, does Mike McDaniel's credentials stand out on its own for him to be a leader of an entire organization? That's where my big question mark comes in.
And I think that it's fair, because I think it's the same thing you would talk about with Brian Daboll in a lot of ways. So a high-level thing here that I think people are going to push back on and why Vrabel gets some traction in a lot of ways is because what has your history been as a head coach, and what has the organization's history been when it comes to who they've hired? Coming up here in a second, we'll go a layer deeper here on LaFleur and some things that I can hopefully point to that mitigate the concerns around his time with the New York Jets. And then we'll flip it over to the GM candidate who I think can help to elevate LaFleur in a head coaching role. We'll do that here in just one moment. Okay, so as we talk about head coach GM tandems here, Mike LaFleur, the one thing that I would point to as well is, and this is hard because you could look to the 49ers, you can look to the Rams and say, they've been consistent and stable. But when you brought up the Garoppolo piece, this is where I put it positively for LaFleur. Now, again, if he identified Zach Wilson as being the heir apparent in the future of the franchise, that's a concern. However, if you look at it as, if you give me a veteran quarterback that I can trust to execute, that I know Garoppolo is not a Hall of Fame quarterback, but if you give me consistency, I'm going to show you that this offense can hum, even as you're building it up, right? They got Deebo Samuel in there, I think, after even he left his time in San Francisco. So he was doing that with nice but not elite parts. Kittles was there, obviously. Same thing when you go to the Rams. One of the things that I like about it this year, because last season you had Puka Nacua, and that's a great breakout player, but then you turn around this season, and we know injuries, a couple, Matthew Stafford has been dinged up all year effectively. But more importantly is you had Puka Nacua's only played in 9 games, Cooper Kupp only in 10, right? And yet this is a team, and you can point to McVay, obviously, but this is a team that still managed to stay competitive. It's still in the conversation, and they still managed to do it through their offensive game plan. And I'll tell you one thing, Whether or not, if you go back and look through their rushing numbers at LaFleur stops through his coaching career here, because he's primarily been passing and off before getting offensive coordinator roles, I will say there's something pretty sexy about looking into the backfield and kind of thinking about Williams and what he's been for the Rams. And I'll tell you right now, Tyrone Tracy Jr., like, I can see that value inside of an offensive system as well. So I want to, again, continue to push the idea that personnel-wise, he's been able to navigate and manage a couple of different scenarios and situations successfully. I think that the overarching question on him is always going to be, before we go to GM, is going to be, is it him? Is it him, or is it the great minds above him that are helping him navigate those situations? And the Jets one, that stop is where you go, well, with no other minds around you, you weren't able to do it. I always go back to, it was a bad team, bad roster, bad personnel.
You know, you pointed out something that I totally agree with you on. If the Giants decide to go bridge quarterback in 2025 and say, you know what, we're not necessarily going to go pick the new quarterback that we want. We want a veteran leader that knows how to run an offense, and we just put a really creative scheme around that veteran that already knows how to get the ball out on time, who the right read is in this progression. Like, if that's going to be the case, I totally can agree with you on Mike LaFleur. I think obviously his time with Jimmy Garoppolo, obviously his time with Matt Stafford, it isn't necessarily teaching them X's and O's because they're veterans. It's more, how do we expand the playbook, knowing that I trust you enough to do the basic functions at the quarterback position very well. Whereas we haven't seen him yet, or it's still yet to be proven, that Mike LaFleur can take a top 5 quarterback draft pick and mold him into the type of NFL player that we want. So I think I would push my chips further in if the Giants said, we don't want to go draft a quarterback very high. We want to go that veteran route.
And that leads me to the next question, because we'll sandwich Matthew Stafford between head coach Mike LaFleur candidate and then our GM candidate that we want to talk about in Spytek. Would you, it sounds like you would you back the LaFleur Stafford ticket? We've heard so much about the Rams and Stafford. Now, my concern here is that you hear that the Rams want to move on from Stafford. You heard that like last year too, and then they didn't. And, you know, they kind of won some football. Same thing this year. I don't know, but now they're staying competitive and they're in the mix. It does feel like the Rams want to maybe move on before it's too late and you're looking at an Aaron Rodgers situation. That's the risk, I think, from a Giants standpoint. But if Big Blue says we end up accidentally, we'll talk on Friday about winning an accidental game here, or just that the Raiders stay ahead of them and they don't like Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders is going to the Raiders, and you don't feel like you're ready to get a QB in this draft, would you be comfortable with saying, hey, free agency, new GM, we'll talk about him, a lot of money to spend, we can build a version where we say over the next 2 seasons with Matthew Stafford, we're going to be fun. The offense is going to hum. It's going to have Malik Neighbors really getting the best value out of QB play, along with any other personnel that you bring in.
Adam, I love the idea of Matt Stafford. This is a very difficult one for me because I don't want to speak hyperbolic about all of this.
Yeah, I know.
But I think Matt Stafford, even at his age, would be this might be a very hot take. Might be the most talented quarterback from a traits perspective that the Giants would have ever had in their illustrious history. And that takes into account Eli Manning being a multi-Super Bowl champion. It takes into account Phil Simms and others that have been part of this organization. But from a
pure talent, he is. Pure talent, he would be. Yeah, pure talent, he would be. Yep,
his arm talent is unbelievable. The throws that he can make from different slot angles, the no-look throws that he's making in the Super Bowl, you're like, this guy is at a different level. So for me, I would be excited about that. I think it would be very interesting because you could see a world where a guy like Wan'Dale Robinson, 80 cents on the dollar to a Cooper Kupp experience where you just make him the possession receiver. You get Puka Nacua looking like Malik Neighbors, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, this could be a top 10 offense with the addition of Matthew Stafford immediately, given that Tyrone Tracy can ascend. So like I said, I didn't want to go hyperbolic, and then I said he might be the greatest quarterback of all time. But I think the addition of Matt Stafford for the Giants would be transformational, and it would give whichever GM and head coach a huge head start to being a relevant potential playoff team right out of the gate.
Now, the Rams have the potential out 2025, 3-year, $125 million. As it currently stands, the 24 25 and 26 cap hits would be 49 and 53 million. So there's that part of it swirling around here. What does that look like? Are they just, going to part ways, the dead cap, all that kind of stuff that could go on here. The biggest problem I think we'll talk about anytime we think about bridge quarterback scenarios, because we're already hearing, by the way, there's going to be 9, maybe 10 openings across the league at all these different spots. We already know the Jets are going to be one of those teams. We're already hearing a lot of other names on that list. Where are the Giants going to be in that hierarchy? Not just from a head coaching perspective, but then also from a GM perspective, also from a veteran quarterback perspective. Some guys are going to be willing to say, I just want the chance to keep playing. I think if you just put Matthew Stafford on the open market right now, he, to your point, he's the number one guy that any team that thinks they want to do some real high level winning are going to pursue. Would that be difficult for the Giants to sell him on? Maybe that comes back to, how do you feel about Mike LeFleur? Do you have a strong connection with him when it comes to the offensive game plan? And do you say, hey, LeFleur, you're going to New York. It's the back end of my career. I'm going to follow you there. My last question on Stafford would be, when you look right across the stadium at Aaron Rodgers, do you have any concern in what would be at 2025, 37 years old, 38 years old in 2028? While Matthew Stafford has not had extensive injuries per se, 2019 was the one where he missed half a season, and then he also had 2022. He's had a couple of years and not too far removed from serious injury troubles, but he's been a guy that hangs in and takes the big hits and makes the throws and plays. Where would your understanding there is some level of risk? Are you really concerned about that risk level over the short term if you bring Stafford in?
I am not, and it's more. Listen, Aaron Rodgers was great for the Green Bay Packers. They obviously moved on from him because he's a little bit of a headache. They already had an heir apparent ready to go. Jordan Love looks to be that part. So there was a lot of things that created that. If the Packers didn't have a backup plan, Aaron Rodgers might still even be the quarterback today. For me, Aaron Rodgers this year, you've seen him come off a huge debilitating Achilles injury. And like the first 8 to 10 weeks have looked pretty terrible to the point where they don't want to bring him back. I don't have those same concerns with Matt Stafford. I also don't necessarily, I think Aaron Rodgers' athleticism and escapability and throwing on the run is what made him such a great quarterback. I don't necessarily see Matt Stafford as a scrambler, guy that needs to move around a lot. I see him as a pure pocket passer that throws with anticipation, that has an arm that can fit a ball into the tiniest of windows. So when I think about the difference between the two quarterbacks, sure, it's a concern when we start talking about age, but the injuries for Stafford, I don't think have zapped what has made him great. Whereas for Aaron Rodgers, when you talk about an Achilles, like he's afraid to even run outside the pocket early on in the season. To me, two completely different injuries. Do you kind of agree with that thought?
Yes, yeah, I think that we've seen it with. Also, we'll talk about him on Kirk Cousins on Friday as well, right? Like, we've seen a certain specific type of injury can be debilitating to a quarterback at any age, let alone as you're getting a little bit older. And I think you're right about Matthew Stafford kind of represents some of that old school QB style, right? I want to be in the pocket, and he has mobility, as we know. He can move around and run, but his primary is to be able to pick apart defenses from the pocket and to do it in what, again, I'll call traditional style, right? Aaron Rodgers, much like when we look at Patrick Mahomes now, we go, good Lord, this guy's throwing underhand, sidearm, behind the back pitches, and it's all cool and it's all sexy until you're not quite as fast and you're not quite as mobile. And then all of a sudden you're already on the ground before you get to do some of those things. So, I mean, again, you said it before. I don't think it's that hyperbolic to say that like Matthew Stafford would represent the best quarterback from a pure talent evaluation standpoint that the Giants had ever had in their franchise's history. By the way, the Giants had brought in Aaron Rodgers, we'd be saying the same thing as well. So, that barometer is certainly one that's a sliding scale when you look back at their history. Coming up here in a second, though, now we've got a head coach. Now we've got a veteran QB. Who's going to put together the roster? Because guess what? Yeah, everybody goes when we make changes for the Giants organization. Let's take a look at Tampa Bay and John Spytek here coming up in just one moment. Okay, so the reason why yours truly puts together this package is follow the breadcrumb trail. Okay, LaFleur has experience underneath some high offensive minds. You talk about Matt Stafford, obvious pedigree, veteran leadership can really unlock a lot of your weapons. And I thought it was a good point you brought up about Wan'Dale Robinson, because we're now at this phase where we're questioning what is his value. But if we always talk about that with offensive line play and quarterback play, and then your high number 1 draft pick, 6th overall, Malik Neighbors, and what he can be ultimately, it goes down the scale, right? You also have to think about you're going to be losing Darius Slayton. Like either Wan'Dale Robinson is going to be a number 2 or a very elite number 3, but you want to have someone that can do that. So now the veteran QB comes in, and this is where I don't go to who's the assistant GM, take the offensive coordinator, take the assistant GM, elevate him. Tampa Bay is fascinating to me. Now, they run a 2-assistant GM system, but John Spytek is the personnel guy. He's the guy that runs things from free agency, draft standpoint, and he's also the guy that had ties to Tom Brady. And when Tom Brady hit the market after his stint with the Patriots, he said, oh, there's a real opportunity here. Just point stop on that. Does it sell you the sexiness appeal on the idea that here's an assistant GM that had experience with bringing in an older veteran quarterback that was not necessarily his prime anymore, but understood 2 things. 1, the process of building the team around them, and also navigating into and out of it, because the Tampa Bay Buccaneers have gone ahead and seemingly done that again to a lesser extent with Baker Mayfield and what they've accomplished in the years recently.
Adam, what I love about Spytek as a potential option for the Giants is that he's not a guy that decides there's one way to do this. There isn't one path that I have to follow, and this is the only system, and all of my players are going to fit in that system. Look, they went out and got Tom Brady. Obviously, that's a huge move to be able to get a Hall of Fame quarterback. But then you got to go all in, right? You have to make the decision to say, we're pushing our chips into the center, and we are going to try to win this thing. And guess what? They did, and they had great success. And he had to be able to try to keep that team intact, sign some free agents that from the team like Levante David. You have to make shrewd drafting decisions with guys like Antoine Winfield Jr. and Tristan Wirfs. You have to figure out a whole way to make this thing work. But then, instead of going into full tank mode, full rebuild mode, we put our chips in on Tom Brady, he turned it around and said, how do we keep this thing afloat? How do we continue to have sustained success? And he ended up grabbing Baker Mayfield and turning him into what we see, which is Pro Bowl level play from Baker Mayfield. So for me, Adam, the reason why I like Spytek as an option is because he's done it a whole host of ways. Drafting well, signing people that were key contributors to your team to longer-term deals, bringing in experienced veterans to help win Super Bowls. To me, that checks all the different boxes. If he is the one doing all the personnel, that to me, like, what else could you want from an assistant GM that maybe has never been a full-blown GM on his own? To me, that seems like a home run pick.
And it's funny too. So just as a clarification, because you'd say, well, Adam, if you're going to go that route, why not look at the coaching staff in Tampa Bay? But Liam Cohen's the offense coordinator. He just got that job now this season. So I don't know where I lean on that. Although when you think about obviously at the top there with Todd Bowles, a more defensive first-minded head coach, because then they have a run game coordinator, defensive line, and Casey Rogers, Larry Foote, obviously in there as well as the pass game coordinator and inside linebackers, which, by the way, the overlapping of staff and the way that their roles work in Tampa underneath, guess what? A former New York Jets coach in Todd Bowles has been fascinating to look at, but I don't necessarily look at that staff and say, oh, here's a guy that I would want to pull in that way. So I'll run through very quickly here because you started to mention it there. The way that there's a really good, I'm going to paraphrase the quote here basically. When you go back through Spytek and his experience, he essentially has had like some missteps in his career. He was with Cleveland and when they got rid of the entire staff there. Then he went to Denver and got to be an area regional scout with them before building himself back up to this assistant GM role. What I like from him though was he looked at it, as you just mentioned, about not everything has to get one way. There's multiple options here. And when he's had experiences where overall the organization he was with did not have success, there seems to be a real calculation of, okay, what does that mean for me? What would be a good landing spot so I can continue to learn from and apply some of that information? So I like that there's some level of experience here around success at different spots and even a lack of success at different spots, because it means it's informing your decision-making process. But quickly, if I could, you go back to, and you remember, as you were talking about some of the hits that they had, some of the success they had, he went out and got Jason Pierre-Paul to help build up that Super Bowl winning roster there with Tom Brady. Devin White was also one of the picks in the draft there as he came in. You mentioned before about Winfield Jr. You also had, I want to make sure I don't miss out on it, Ndamukong Suh was a key free agent acquisition that they went out and acquired. You mentioned Wirfs and Winfield in there as well. He also went out when he got Tom Brady and was able to, although, just as a caveat, there's the other half of the GM tandem that handles the money side, but they were able to navigate, go get these veterans. Let's keep our wide receiver core together. Even in the transition over to Baker Mayfield, we all thought, well, where are they going to sell off these wide receivers? Because it's going to be rebuild time and Baker Mayfield will be the lamb to the slaughter. No, we're going to bring them all back because it makes us good. And it rounds me out to that question I want to ask you, which is, okay, we follow this path. It's LeFleur and it's Stafford and it's Spytek. And they build a stable organization over the short term. I feel, while I want the franchise quarterback, make no mistake about it. And when Arch Manning becomes available, it's going to be a conversation. But the idea that you can still be a competitive team, even when you know maybe Super Bowls aren't going to be the end game, even when you know you're going to compete for the division and hopefully win a playoff game or two along the way, I am at the point as a Giants fan where I say, that's what I want. Just tell me you can be stable. Tell me, we talked about this before. Tell me you can be the Pittsburgh Steelers and just show up and be competitive year over year and then spike some opportunities. And I know that the majority of the fan base does not like that idea. After everything that's gone on, it's hard to sell the fan base on. We just want to be solid. We're not worried about championships yet, but sometimes I think it's okay to maybe take that step back after the disaster that you've seen unfold these last couple of years.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's the reason why last week we discussed Mike Vrabel. It at least gets you a benchmark of
Yes.
like, okay, we're not
Yes.
going to be horrific. You know what I mean? We're elevating everyone, and then we can figure it out from there. A question for you, Adam, is
Yes, sir.
I like this setup, but
Thank
one thing that you had pointed out to me was I started with Mike Vrabel, and I said, well, bring in John Robinson because they work together, and you were like, uh-oh, like we're hiring a coach, and then
Yes.
he's helping dictate who the GM is. In this situation, if you have to prioritize, are you prioritizing John Spytek or are you prioritizing Mike LaFleur in terms of who you would want to hire first?
Yeah, so that's very interesting. And because we're still going to have a number of other coaching candidates, I think that we're going to discuss here, obviously, I would say if you ask me right in this moment, Spytek's number one for me. And we went head coach because that's the sexier thing. That's the
Yeah.
conversation, and it gets you down the road of some of this discussion. I think Spytek is a name that you'll hear talked about this offseason when it comes to GM openings. And I just listen, we know that Joe Shane was regarded that way too, heavily on scouting and personnel. But the history with Spytek and the bridge between different versions of Tampa Bay and the ability to still form rosters and have success, that's a big selling point for me because it kind of means, hey, listen, head coaches may come and go, but you're going to help be the architect of stability. I like that a lot. So I probably would sell it. And by the way, because I think you're going to agree with me, I would also add this caveat. 3 out of the last head coaches for the New York Football Giants have been first-time head coaches. Pat Shermer had his stint with the Denver Broncos, obviously, and it did not work out. 9-22, I think, in his head coaching role there, which is why at the time of the hire, we all thought, interesting. But that probably is a give you pause moment for the Giants. And that's the Vrabel selling point. Or we'll talk about looking at Cliff Kingsbury potentially. Guys that have had experience at the highest level because your responsibilities shift greatly when you become the head coach. And that's something I think that will play a factor here.
Yeah, Ben McAdoo, Joe Judge, and now Brian Dable are 3 of the last 4 or 5 head coaches that the Giants have had no head coaching experience, and each of them has led to where we're having Wednesday shows about this. So, talk to
Now,
me,
I've
Adam.
got two. I got 2 quick ones before we get out the door.
Hit me.
We talked about this last week with Vrabel and staff, and you threw out some names that could be there. First of all, former New York Football Giant Chase Blackburn is the current special teams coordinator for the LA Rams. Come
Good
on
call.
now. I don't know if he's, defensive coordinator worthy. I don't know if it's a lateral or side move to go to a linebacker coach, whatever it may be. Interesting to think about it that way. And then I'll go back to the name that you mentioned earlier, and I think is very fun to talk about, and that's Robert Saleh. If
100%.
I'm the Giants and I say I'm hiring Mike LaFleur, and LaFleur goes, hey, let's go ahead and flip this. Robert Saleh, I know it didn't work as a head coach, but you were damn good as a defensive coordinator. And by the way, just like the 49ers, there's a lot of talent up front right now. Still have work to do for the roster, but there's a lot of talent on that defensive unit for the New York Football Giants. And I would be pretty damn excited about putting Robert Saleh back in the, hey, We are loud. We're angry. You remember how he was as a DC for the 49ers before his soul was stolen as a head coach of the Jets, and he looked like a sad puppy. That dude was jumping up, getting pumped up in the faces of his players. They loved him in that role in San Francisco. I would love that as the DC for Big Blue.
Well, and think about this, Adam. The one last wrinkle I will give you, because I know we got to get out of here. But Mike LaFleur, jettisoned by the Jets, was let go. Robert Saleh, jettisoned by the Jets, let go. What if they came into New York and had this chip on their shoulder of like, our ultimate goal is to be successful so that we can win championships? But it would be a nice, sweet, sweet byproduct to just stick it to the New York Jets and say, it's your dysfunction that was the cause of this, not our coaching abilities.
And by the way, not that I would advocate for it, but if you ended up hiring Joe Douglas as the GM, like, and you just went and said, hey man, everything. And by the way, you know what the problem is? Like, right when you get to that spot, you go, oh yeah, Robert Saleh is the DC, and now, but LaFleur's had experience over there. If they did that, which I'm not advocating for, you turn around and you go, well, no, that's too many familiar faces.
Yeah,
like,
now we're too much of the Jets. We're too much of the Jets. Yeah. So Adam, question: at the end of the day, this is a great setup. I like how you did it in terms of not necessarily connecting too many dots between the GM and the coach. Sometimes we need to shake the snow globe a little bit more to get better results. Where would you put this, knowing that there's still probably a handful more of these sessions that we're going to do? Where do you put this one? I think I put my John Robinson and Mike Vrabel at number 3. I believe. Did you put him at 4?
I put him at 5, and I said I might have regrets being too low, but I did put him at 5.
Okay, you put him at 5. And so where does I know we talked about Robert Saleh, we talked about Matt Stafford, but where does the John Spytek, Mike LaFleur foundation get you?
You know what I think we're gonna have to do too at some point? A little bit of a long run, a little longer episode here. I think we are gonna have to do the version of this where we rank not only the coaches separately, but also the GM separately. So we see, and then the tandems together. Because because
I say that because Adam, to your point, it's like, all right, so just on the piece of paper, you have Spytek and LaFleur, and you're like, is that better than Vrabel? Like, is it better? But then it's like, but what if he gets Matt Stafford? What if you could bring Robert Saleh and fix the defense? Like, all of those things matter, but foundationally, if you can only start with 2, a head coach and a GM tandem, where do you put these 2 in terms of your priority list?
I'm going to put it maybe somewhat a little affectionately. I'm going to put it 7, I would say. I'm going to put it 7 because I think there's a clear unknown commodity with LaFleur. Hasn't done it before. I like the GM. I think, by the way, I wouldn't be disappointed about this. There'd be reasons to be excited about it. But as we move along, there's guys with head coaching history backgrounds. There's GMs that maybe have more of a voice in both the personnel and financials. So there's some things here that I'd like to be better. And by the way, it goes back to Robinson for me personally might have been a bit of what brought down Mike Vrabel, especially because on the back end of the relationship in Tennessee, there were issues in terms of decision-making, Brown and what they chose to do there. So there's some things going on there that gave me pause on that front. Likewise, I can't sit here right now today and say that Mike LaFleur is one of the top 5 coaching candidates out there. He's not. He's not one of the top 5 guys, I think, when we get to this offseason that you'll hear around the NFL. For that reason, I can't put them higher than, say, 7 if we're doing our top 10.
I think that's a very fair spot. I have him at number 8 in my rankings in terms of the top 10. I think it's a viable situation and setup. But I think to your point, we're just talking about like, hey, if you told me that Matt Stafford was coming with him, that all of a sudden can move up in the list in terms of high priority. Yeah. If you tell me we can get a defensive coach in Robert Saleh, that continues to move things up. If you tell me we get Travis Hunter and we have Matt Stafford and all of a sudden we're changing the dynamic, things can progress very quickly. But when we're talking about the foundation, it feels like when we're only talking about those 2 guys, there's a bunch of other candidates that are either have been head coaches that deserve their second shot or are so light years in terms of innovation that you're like, man, I would love to just get a piece of that for a little bit.
And you better believe it, man. And by the way, so a couple of things here. One, we're going to talk to Detroit Lions staff. We're going to talk to Commanders because Andy really likes this Cliff Kingsbury idea that's out there. You've got Houston on the radar. That's 3 that right there by itself, let alone other coordinators that look strong, San Francisco, GMs, all that kind of stuff. So we're going to continue to roll through this at the end of the season and then into the offseason as well. But on Friday, don't worry, guys. We get it. this organization is massively dysfunctional. We're going to tap back into that narrative. And ironically, it's going to come to a head against the Atlanta Falcons. There was a veteran QB, good, bad decision, potential bridge quarterback, and then the rookie, the starting quarterback for the Atlanta Falcons against the Giants, going to be Michael Penix Jr. That's going to be staring you square in the face because the New York Football Giants had the choice, the decision, the option to bring him into the building, and we could have been watching him maybe for the last half of this season. All of those things, and so much more, are going to be on OGP. That's why you get over to YouTube and you subscribe, you turn on the alerts so you know when we're going live. You also get over to the podcast feed wherever you get those needs fulfilled, at Adam Armbrecht, at AMAC214, and at One Giant Podcast on X. Because, by the way, friends, we've been breaking some narratives these days. So go ahead and tap into it wherever you get those needs fulfilled. But until the next time, until the best times, as Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand that people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.